35 years. That's just a few years younger than I am. A little less than half. But today, on this anniversary day, there are moments when it's good to go back and ask, what are we all about? What is at the very heart of who we are, why we are here, why we attach our names to Jesus? What is there about him, his theology, his truth, his many names that so captures us that we say we will be followers of Jesus? I want to take you to the most primary story in all of Scripture. It's a story that's known around the world by people from other faiths. It's one you know so well. In fact, you know it so well, when we begin to read it, you will think, I've heard so many sermons on this story, there's nothing more I can learn. I'd like you to read and listen to it again for the very first time. And pretend that we are sitting on a hillside listening to Jesus. We are first century Jews. We aren't 21st century Canadians. We listen to it through the ears of first century Jews. We look at the picture that Jesus is painting through first century eyes. And we accept the message through first century Jewish hearts. If we do it that way, then we'll better understand what Jesus was saying to them, because if we understand what they understood, there's a better chance that we today will understand. Does that make sense? Yes. All right. Let's go to Luke, the 15th chapter. There are 4 portraits of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each has their own portrait. They are individuals speaking out of their own life and experience and understanding. Luke is a bit of a historian. He wrote both Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and he wrote the Acts of the Apostles, which is the history of the early church in Jerusalem and beyond. So he has this inclination to think about what Jesus said and did within the context of history. And this story that Jesus tells is a story that has enormous resonance with people that are listening. Now, I'm a prairie boy. I was raised in Saskatchewan. And the Rough Riders didn't even win last night. Can you imagine? You know, there are 3 kinds of people in the world. Those who are from Saskatchewan, those who wish they were from Saskatchewan, and those who have no ambition in life at all. We all hear and see stories out of our own context. So let's go back to the early Jewish one. Now, Luke sets up this time of the story. You notice in the first verse of chapter 15, he tells us the setting. It isn't just to those of you in Radioland. No, these are real people. And you got 4 kinds of people that Jesus is talking to. He's talking to the tax collectors. Now, they weren't just kind of good bureaucrats that worked for Revenue Canada that we think are necessary, because I want to make sure, Pastor Audley, that they get your tax. Okay? I want you to pay your tax. Because if I'm paying mine, I want you to pay yours. And you want me to pay mine. So we hire those bureaucrats to make sure of it. These tax collectors were Jews hired by the Romans. And the Romans, they dominated the world. And they dominated Israel. And as a Jew, you had to pay tax to the Romans. But you had your own friends coming to be tax collectors. But often they would try and extract more from us than what was legitimate, and they would put it in their pocket. Remember Zacchaeus? He paid back what he had illegitimately got. So the tax collectors were not our friends. And then there's those sinners. You know, that's your brothers-in-law you cross the street to avoid. the sinners. That's a collective term. Then there were the Pharisees. Now, I think the Pharisees have got a bit of a bad rap. They were good guys. About 10% of the population. What they were trying to do, they were trying to keep the Greek culture, which the Romans brought. The Romans didn't have so much of their own culture. They accepted the Greek culture, the Greek gods, and the Romans, who were the captors, who were the occupiers of Israel, of that region, they brought with them the Greek culture. And the Pharisees they started about 150 years before Christ. And what they wanted to do, they wanted to hold back the incursion of Greek culture into their world. And they had gymnasiums, for example, the Greeks did. They brought those to Israel. Now, in Greek gymnasium, it was only men that competed, but they competed in the nude. And for a Jew, nudity is absolutely forbidden. It is an extreme violation of everything we believe in. So nudity was completely unaccepted. And so the Pharisees, they wanted to hold back the influence of the Greeks. Kind of like the CRTC. You kind of want to hold back all the American stuff coming across. But they were good. I would buy a used car from a Pharisee. All right? So they were okay. Then you have teachers of the law. Well, I was at Tyndale long enough to know about teachers that mutter. No, they were nice people. Anyhow, there are real people that Jesus is speaking to. And he comes to the story. Now, what I'd like you to do, you just may want to close your eye. I love to close my eyes and listen to words. Listen to these words. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went, hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I'll set out and go back to my father and say, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. And the son said, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf and kill it. And let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive. He is lost and is found.' And so that little village began to rock and roll and party like they hadn't in 35 years. Oops. So they began to celebrate. Now there are 2 sons in the story. This morning we'll just deal with the first son. Now as you listen to that story, what did you really hear the young man ask of his father? What did he really ask of him? What was his really, the fundamental question that was under the surface of the superficial question of, "I want my estate"? Wasn't he really saying, "Father, I wished you'd drop dead"? Because how else do you get your estate? Oh, today we have all kinds of mechanisms where we can pass on our estates or our values of our estate to our children earlier, and we got tax advantages and all that. But back, we're first century Jews. Because your estate is caught up in what? What is the essential ingredient of what you own? What is it? That's it. I mean, what's the debate about in the Middle East today? It's all about land. It's all about land then too. So how do you give land early? Now, when we hear that story, we know what's going to happen. We're listening, and as Jesus telling the story, we're quite shocked because father is dominant in that culture. Father is dominant. Women, as we know, are almost chattels. They have next to no rights. That's why Jesus' defense of women in his ministry was so stunning and powerful and revolutionary. But father's dominant. So we know what's going to happen. The young man asked this question, can I have my estate? Or basically, Father, I wish you'd pass it. The father's going to backhand the kid and throw him out. Oh, that doesn't happen. Oh, now we know what's going to happen. The oldest son is going to do, kind of the Hillary Clinton shuttle diplomacy and bring them together. That doesn't happen either. And to our absolute amazement, the father does what the son asks. But then, there's a banker's term. It says, and he got together all he had. Okay, so if it's land that he got together, you don't carry land anywhere with you. So what? Oh, we know what happened. He went next door to Mr. Abe Suskovich. And he said, Mr. Suskovich, I have some land to sell. Young man, you have some land to sell. What land do you have? Well, my inheritance. Your father died? No one told me. No, Mr. Suskovich, my father didn't die. I just wanted my estate earlier. And what are you going to do with your estate? You mean to say the land that we crossed the Jordan with Joshua to conquer, that your great-great-grandparents and your great-grandparents and your grandparents and your father, we have looked after that soil, we know how much. And for $1, yet we sell and we buy a property. So land is sold. Now, look what's going on in this story. First of all, the son has violated the right of the father to be father. He has humiliated him in front of his family, and in public. Humiliation. And the Middle East and East, Asia, face means everything. You cannot lose face. Secondly, he's taken the most precious commodity, what defines us, land, and sold it. And then what does he do? He goes, and we got a code word here. Some of you folk have learned how white people use code words to not say what they really mean and yet be politically correct. You know what code words are. Now, I'm a Pentecostal and I've lived with a few code words in my life with you Baptists, but that's another thing. It's a little humor, folks, very little. So what does he do? He goes into a distant country. Oh, what does that mean? Well, it means he's leaving Israel. Distant country? It means it's the Gentile country. And you know what the Gentile country is? It's where the dogs live, because Gentiles are Goy's dogs. Not only are they culturally very much depraved, but spiritually, they're pagans. So to go to a distant country means I'm leaving the country of God. When Jonah was told to go to Nineveh, I was just by Nineveh a few weeks ago, up in northeastern Iraq. Interesting place. It's called the Nineveh Plains. When Jonah was told to go to Nineveh, you know what he did? Rather than go, if this is the Mediterranean, rather than go from here up into Iraq, into Nineveh, he took a boat and he was trying to go all the way across the Mediterranean to the southern part of Spain. And I thought to myself, why? Why didn't he just say, no, God, I won't go. It would have been a little easier, eh? A little less expensive. Why did he have to leave Israel? Because for a Jew, God and Israel, the land, are one. If you leave Israel, you're leaving God. And so he is saying symbolically to everyone, not only do I embarrass, humiliate my father, not only do I sell the most precious part of our identity and our life land, but I take that and I go into a country by leaving behind Jehovah, Elohim. All the words, I'm leaving this behind because I'm leaving the country. If I can get away from my country, I can get away from God. And if I get away from God, all bets are off. And we listen to the story in enormous shock. And then he loses his money. And this will be important, as we'll hear in a moment. He loses his money, and then he ends up feeding swine. And you know how popular a kosher sandwich is a ham sandwich is at a kosher feast. And this is the story. A Mideast expert who's lived all of his life there and speaks all the languages said he has never heard in all the literature, modern, ancient, extant literature, he has never heard a story that so violates everything important in the culture. This young man has sunk as low as he can go in the eyes of the Jews. He can't go any lower. And then he wakes up. He says, this is really crazy. Really crazy. I'm starving. And the slaves back at Dad's place have more to eat. So why am I here? Now we're listening as first century Jews, and we know one of his problems. It's not said here, but we know it. We know what it is. It's called the kasasa. The kasasa was a ceremony that was performed on Jewish young men if they did one of two things: if they married an immoral woman, or if they lost their money to Gentiles. And he had just lost his money to Gentiles. And the word certainly had gotten back to the village. And what they would do, the townspeople would get these pots, earthen pots, full of burnt corn and nuts. And they would gather around you, and they would smash those pots on the ground, and they'd say, you are forever cut off from the land of your fathers. You no longer can enter this village. Well, for me, I just say, I'll move to Brampton. Or I'll go to Tel Aviv. I know, we're first century Jews. Village is everything. It tells me who I am, what I'm worth, who protects me. Village, people, community. That means everything. He lives in fear. You know, in the Old Testament, when you're reading through the Old Testament, it comes to these begats. Someone begat. They were kind of prolific in those days, weren't they? Sorry. And your eyes glaze over and you just go, but if you're a Jew, you want to know what those begats are, because you want to know where you fit, where your tribe, where your family fits within the larger tribe, because that is your identity. And so for a young man to be thrown out of his village, to be disinherited, to be cut off, is an enormous social psychological shock to his sense of identity and well-being and future. And he's afraid to go back because he knows exactly what's going to happen. The kasasa is going to be performed on him. And yet it gets so bad, he finally says, regardless of what happens, this is really idiocy to be here. I'm going to go back. Well, then, notice as he goes back. Now, the Greek language is a wonderful language because it's very precise. And it says what it means, and it means what it says. And notice what he says. So he's on his way home. And I'm not very enamored by this young man. I think he's kind of self-centered, a bit of narcissistic, to use a contemporary term. But he's smart in that he says, as he's working, working his way home. And you know when you've done something wrong, when you're working your way home, got a little time, you're kind of working out what the story is. I worked with young people for a long time. I was president of Youth for Christ here for some time. And when I worked with young people, I said, if you've blown it, if you dented the car, if you got in late, if you failed the exam, don't defend yourself, don't try to argue. Just start off with say, I'm wrong and I'm sorry. What more can they do but kill you? So start off that way. And that's how he started off. But notice what he's going to say to his father. So he says, I'll set out and go back to my father and said, I've sinned. I'm no longer worthy to call your son. Make me like, and it says here in the NIV, one of your hired men. Now, there's a variety of words he could have used to describe what he wanted his father to make of it. He could have used the word doulos, which is slave. But he doesn't use the word doulos. He could have used the word diakonos, which means house servant. But he doesn't use that either. He uses the interesting word misthos, which means skilled laborer. Now, I don't want you to go start a new denomination over my interpretation of this. But I do ask myself the question, why did he use misthos instead of diakonos or doulos? Why did he say the word skilled laborer? Well, if he was a slave, he would just have existence looked after. If he was a house servant, he would have a salary, he'd get paid for it, but he would be confined to that house. So I wondered what would a skilled laborer? A skilled laborer would be someone who has a skill. Somebody who's an electrician, or is an IT person, or is a teacher, or is a cook or something. And you've got a skill, and what you can do, you can work as hard as you can work. By the way, I love that reading of Proverbs. You can work as hard as you can work, and you can make as much money as you can make by your work. And I wondered, maybe the young man, what he wants to do, he wants to come back, and he would like to get a job with a skill so that he can earn enough money to go back to Mr. Suskovich and buy the property back and give it back to his father and restore himself to his family. That's what I would try to do. Because I don't know about you, but the default where I find myself slipping to when I think about God and his love for me is that God will love me as long as I do the things he wants me to do. In other words, if I've got enough brownie points, I can earn my way into the good graces of the Father. As I travel, I go to about 25 countries a year. And as I travel to the other countries, every other major religion is based on the notion of good works. That I do enough good that outweighs my bad. And that, you ask somebody, this week, ask 5 people, just kind of out of the blue, on what basis would God let you into heaven? And my experience is 90% of the people, even people with a Christian heritage, will say, if I've done enough good, God will let me into heaven. Isn't that how we kind of incline ourselves? We think that's the way it works. And so he is on his way home. And the Pharisees, of course, are delighted because they believe that the way how you get God to approve you and like you is that you do enough good things. And that's why the Pharisees became such boggleheads, because what they ended up taking good ideas and saying, yes, but you've got to fulfill these 855 laws for God to love you. And so when they hear Jesus tell this story, and it seems that this young man wants to go back and earn his way back into the good favor of his father, they say, hey, maybe this rabbi from Nazareth knows more than we gave him credit for. But the story goes on. Now, I don't know how you envisage the story. I don't know what picture is in your mind of where the Father is, where the Son is, and how the Father sees the Son. Now, as a prairie boy, I always thought the farm is out in the field, where your farm is. But now we're living in first century Israel. You see, a few years before, After Herod had built all of these huge public works, including the great temple in Jerusalem, and the great pipeline up here at Caesarea Philippi, and the huge works, there were 40,000 men that were laid off, and they were out. They had no work, and so thievery became part of the kind of the MO of looking after your family. So what people lived together. So even though this man was fairly well-to-do, we assume in the story, he lived in the village with everybody else, behind a common stone fence with one gate. And so the father was not out on the farm, as I thought. He's in the village living with everybody else. Well-to-do, probably a two-story house. He's up in the evening. He's having a Starbucks and reading the Jerusalem Post. And he looks across the fence, the stone fence of the village, and people are coming, going, and it's twilight now. And then he sees someone coming by himself. Doesn't pay much attention. Watches. Goes back, reading, doing what he's doing. He looks up and he sees, and as he sees this man coming to him, there's something familiar. It's strange. He's just kind of caught, his eyes caught. He keeps watching, and the closer the person gets, he realizes it's the way he's walking. And only his son walks that way. So he watches and watches. He gets closer and closer. And while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, was filled with compassion for him, and sauntered out to meet him. Oh no, sorry, I misread. He ran to his son. Now we're first century. What did men wear there? Robes. What do you do when you're wearing a robe and you want to run? There's our problem. We're first century Jews. Men were not to show their legs. But some of you guys I understand, but this was a real rule. You're not to show your legs. The father has a choice. He's probably a man of means and highly regarded in the community. The children are out playing in the evening. He could saunter out to meet his son, but what's the other danger? The villagers would know he was coming and would surround him with the kasasa and humiliate him and throw him out of his village. He can let that happen. Or he can run, humiliate himself, and be there first. You know, when you look at the picture of the crucifixion, the paintings, they're all wrong. I've never seen one that's right. Why? The men were nude. That's the way the Romans would humiliate you. Absolute humiliation. Crucifixion was horrific physically. But it humiliated the men in ways that they never would have been humiliated otherwise. That's how grave it is. That's how grave it was. It is today, but back then. Just think about your Middle East religions today and the way they deal with women covering up. And so just extrapolate from that and you understand how this matters to the culture. And the father, what does he do? Instinctively. He doesn't even have to think about it. He raises his robes, he humiliates himself, and he runs to the son to beat everyone else there so that he, the son, will not be humiliated. The father, he can be humiliated as long as the son isn't humiliated. And he throws his arms around him and kisses him. Men in the Middle East there don't kiss their sons. Oh, the son might come up and bow and touch your feet,
he might kiss a ring, but for the father to embrace and to... And you can just hear him stuttering out what he has remembered. But the father says, no. Hey, you know that heifer we got? Man, that's enough for not just for the family, the whole village is going to rock and roll tonight. And you bring the robe, and you bring the ring, and you bring the sandals. My son was lost and is found. Ladies and gentlemen, what can tell us more about the absolute love of the Father for you? How much does he love you? Do you have any idea? Do you have any idea how much he loves you, young man? I don't. But I look at this story and I realize that the great story of the gospel is that the Father, in his absolute love for you, when we have taken the best he has given us and we have squandered it, we have lost it, we have gone out to that foreign country, and the very best that he could have given us, we have sold and we have lost, we have humiliated with the Father, we have humiliated the family, we have humiliated the village, the community. The Father comes and runs and humiliates himself so that we first would be lifted and reunited. His love for us, his love for the world. When we go to our community, when we go to work tomorrow, when we go back to family, if we could say, Lord, give us those eyes of the Father that helps us see through the love that you have for others, that I too might see that love for others. How it would transform the way we speak and think of others. If I could only but see through the eyes of that young man who walking up to the village and seeing my father come running towards me, the man I've humiliated and I've violated, I've done everything wrong that I could for him, and he comes running to me and he doesn't even give me a chance to earn my way back. He says, you're forgiven. Oh, if I could see the eyes of the Father through his eyes and know how much I'm loved and made the beloved. That's the gospel. That's the gospel. Oh, we've all shucked off the good things of life, haven't we? We've all lost our inheritance in one way or another. Well, I'm a preacher's kid. My mother thought the word PK for years meant perfect kid. I was a performer. I learned to perform. Religious people, we do that. The Pharisees did that. But we all lose our inheritance. You and I know we lost it. We lose it. It slips through our hands, the very best that God has for us. And yet he says, I want you home. I want you home. I want to forgive you. I want to forgive you. Oh, the inheritance. I got more of where that came from. I got more to give you. So this morning, my friend, in this anniversary service, we're going to have a prayer. And after the prayer, I'm going to just, with no one looking, I'm going to ask a question of you. And it's this. Are you at the place today where you say, Father, I want to come back home.